Yeah, good day. Welcome to another section. Mktg 305, Consumer Behavior. Today we'll focus on section 7, which has to do with consumer perceived risks, which is also an aspect of perception. Let's have an overview. Perception of risks is another important factor that influences consumer motivation and hence the decisions consumers make in the marketplace. As consumers, we are influenced by a multiplicity of factors, including our own perception of risks in a given situation. It's not enough to have a technically competent product for one to achieve marketplace success. Where there's perception of risks in relation to our offering, an otherwise technically competent product can fail woefully. So perception of risks is of importance to marketers. By way of outline, we look at 5 interrelated issues. We attempt an explanation of the concept of perceived risks by looking at factors that influence perception of risks. We'll also be concerned with the various types of risks that may influence purchase and consumption related decision making. And we'll end by trying to look at some strategies for reducing consumer perceived risks. This is because where there's high perception of risk, brands may perform badly. This is your reading list. Where it's important, I will direct you via Sakai for further reading. I'll start by saying that virtually everything we do in the marketplace, being it a decision to marry, decision to enroll on an educational program, decision to buy a high involvement item like a car or house, comes with some level of risk. Even the buying of everyday food items comes with some level of risk. And it's important that marketers need to understand the nuances in relation to decision making. How do we define perceived risks? It's simply the uncertainty that consumers face when they cannot foresee the consequences of their purchase decisions. In a situation where we are unable to tell the possible outcome of our purchase and consumption related decision making, we say there's perceived risks, and therefore this should be important to marketers. To the extent that we are uncertain about the outcome of an action in relation to buying a product or a service, there's some level of risk perception. But you know that as individuals we are different, so we may vary in terms of our tolerance for risks. The same way as marketers are interested in market segments, different segments may have different thresholds in relation to their tolerance for risks. What is important about perceived risks is that it's not about the reality. Consumers will be influenced by risks they perceive, regardless of whether this risk perception is founded or unfounded. In other words, when you send a child to a dark room and there's no monster there, and for whatever reason the child believes there's a monster there, it influences his or her behavior. In reality, there's no monster there. But once he has perceived that there's a monster in that room, chances are that he will not even go to the room at all. It's the same way. So perception of risks doesn't matter whether it's founded, it's real or not. Once consumers perceive risks, it influences their behavior. Therefore, as marketers or businesses, we need to understand consumer risk perception. So risks that consumers do not perceive will not influence their behavior. If a product comes with high risks, yet the target market do not perceive risks, it will not influence their behavior negatively, and vice versa. In discussing perceived risks, it's important that we make some distinction in terms of the two broad purchasing situations. We can talk of what we call the high involvement purchase situation and the low involvement purchase situation. Involvement theory is simple. We tend to pay a lot of attention to what we describe as high involvement purchase decision. That requires a lot of mental processing, a lot of attention, and of course a lot of inputs in the form of money, time, and so on and so forth. The opposite too is true. Low involvement purchase situations has to do with things that we consider less important and therefore do not require us to expend a lot of cognitive energy or time on. So there are two distinctions: high involvement purchase situation or low involvement purchase situation. Whether low or high, there's always some level of perceived risk, but all things being equal, in a high involvement purchase situation, consumers tend to perceive high risk, unlike in a low purchase situation. Though I have said that virtually all conditions come with some perception of risk, perceived risk can be associated with any product or service. However, it tends to be high when the following occur, and the opposite too is true. One, where there's little information about the product or service, uncertainty in this case goes high. So perceived risk goes high. In other words, when there's a new service provider and as a consumer you have little information about this service provider, you tend to perceive high risks. Two, a situation where the product or service in question is new to the target market. Perceived risks tend to be high. I mean, when certain banks, so years not long ago, the economy was open to some foreign banks because they were new in the Ghanaian environment. Initially there was high perception of risks, mainly because they are new. Point three is that where the product or offer attracts high price, consumer perceived risks tend to be high. And of course, we know why. Once we are parting away with large sums of money, we are worried as to the possible outcome or the benefits of the product. Where the product or service is technologically complex, perceived risks also tend to be high. Where it involves, the technology is not easy to use and all that, consumer perception of risk tend to be high. Point five is where there are fairly substantial quality differences between brands. Consumers might make an inferior choice. In other words, where there are fairly substantial quality differences between brands, perceived risks tend to be high. So in any product category where there are several alternatives, consumers struggle in making decisions because of the opportunity cost of not making the right decision, because there are quality differences. You go to, when it comes to the mobile phones, there are several of them. There are a lot of items like that. There are several of them, they look the same, yet we know that there are quality differences. Perceived risks tend to be high. And especially where this is fairly new to the target market. 6, where consumers have little confidence or previous experience in terms of how to evaluate the product or the service on offer. Where it's difficult because we don't have previous knowledge in terms of what to look out for. Somebody who is buying a car for the first time, who's new to cars, will take a longer time in evaluating or in coming to a purchase decision. Or somebody who is buying a product that is technologically complex and this is the first experience, it will be difficult because he or she has no basis to evaluate the brand, and the opposite too is true. the seventh point is that where the opinion of others are important, and consumers are likely to be judged by the purchase. There are several products that we can describe as conspicuous, that can fall under what we call conspicuous consumption. Because we live in society and the opinion of others are important. So in buying a new suit, it's your own suit, but you will be concerned about what others will say about your suit. Even common haircut, though it doesn't attract much in terms of price, because others will see us in a new haircut, sometimes it tends to come with high perception of risk, especially if you go to a new barber, for instance. Because haircuts will be consumed conspicuously, others will see. So if you are not conversant with the barber, you tend to perceive high risks. And there are several situations like that, where you have no basis to evaluate the person or the service on offer. Perceived risks tend to be high. Another point is that where the decision cannot be easily reversed, where the purchase or consumption decision cannot be easily reversed, perception of risk can be very high. When you take some herbal, like drugs like paracetamol, we are used to. So ordinarily you go to a pharmacy, you buy, perceived risks tend to be a bit low. But when you are buying a herbal preparation that is new, I mean, you don't have previous experience and all that. And once you take in this herbal preparation, I mean, you cannot easily reverse. Something you consume, you cannot easily reverse. Typically, perceived risks tend to be high. The same way with surgery, somebody who's booked for surgery that's why it takes a long time. They go through counseling and all that, because we cannot easily undo surgery. So perceived risks tend to be high. There are some financial products that when you enter into, you sign on, I mean, it may take a longer, you cannot easily reverse the contract or the agreement. So it normally comes with high perception of risk. There are several examples we can give. And we are saying that generally when the offer is more of service nature perceived risks tend to be high, because services are intangible and judging the quality of service is more difficult than judging physical commodities and all that. So generally, services come with high perception of risks. How do you, for instance, judge services provided by an architect and so on? It's difficult if that is the first time you are dealing with such an architect. There are other factors that also influence consumer perception of risks. The issue of personality of the consumer involved, the shopping situation, and the culture or the subcultural groupings. As individuals, we view the world differently. There are some people who have the tolerance to tolerance for risks. There are others whose personality is such that they are risk averse. So they may perceive, in the marketing situation, they may see things differently. Of course, the shopping situation also impacts on our perception of risks. When you are shopping the company of friends and all that, perceived risks tend to be reduced. When you are, for instance, buying from an unknown retailer, perceived risks also tend to be new, or where you have little time to make decision, perceived risks tend to be high, and vice versa. And of course, anthropologists have observed that there are some cultures or people within some cultural stratum who are able to take high risks, and the opposite too is true. There are some cultures where they are risk averse and all that. So all these things have implication for marketing. For instance, talking about degree of risk, talking about shopping situation, the degree of risk, for instance, would depend on several factors or several situations. Where the product is to be purchased is important. For instance, whether from a known shopping mall, I mean, if it's a reputable shopping mall, perceived risks tend to be risks, even if the product on offer is new. Generally, you go to ShopRite, places that are known, perceived risks tend to be high, tend to be low, and vice versa. Whether you are buying from an unknown hawker or retailer, perceived risks tend to be high. So all these things have implications for marketing. People you deal with ordinarily, retailers, I mean, you take for granted that they will offer you the best. And of course, whether you are buying via the internet, perceived risks tend to be high. This part of the world is now that we are yet to fully appreciate the role of the internet in commercial activities. So a lot of people perceive high risks when they are trying to do, they engage in certain transactions online and so on. All these things come with some implications. And of course, whether you are buying the company of friends and so on and so forth. Now, what are the various types of risks that may be responsible for behavior? In other words, purchase and consumption-related decision-making. There are various types of risks. Let's look at them. That's what we call the functional or performance risks. We buy goods and services because we expect it to meet certain needs or to provide us with certain benefits. This will fall under the functional or performance risks. You buy a mobile phone, you expect the mobile phone to do certain things for you. I mean, it should be able to communicate clearly, it should be durable in terms of battery life, and so on and so forth. There shouldn't be interferences and all that. So buying a mobile phone, for instance, that you are not familiar with, may come with some functional risk. Will this mobile phone perform as advertised and all that? Because of this, consumers will take certain steps in trying to minimize such risk perception. In other words, the consumer may be wondering whether the product or service or event or person, etc., would deliver as promised or as advertised. Thus, will the product function or do what is expected to do? You go to a barbering salon. What do you expect? A nice haircut. The barber is new to you. You are new to the barber. A goal-oriented person will perceive some kind of risk. So he will look out for certain cues. Sometimes he will sit and observe those that are being barbed to be able to evaluate whether to expect a good haircut or not. That will be part of functional risk. When we are buying cars, because cars typically are high involvement purchase situation, that's why prudent garages or car dealers will allow, because of high perception of, will allow for test drive and so on and so forth. Just for you to maybe drive around, maybe for a whole day or sometimes a week, to be convinced as to the performance of the car in terms of speed, agility, turning, and so forth. And that's what we also call the physical or safety risks. This simply has to do with the uncertainty as to whether this product or service will not cause physical or bodily harm to ourselves or other people in our social bracket, our friends, our children, or our family members, and all that. Somebody who is buying some insecticide will be one, and buying a new insecticide may be concerned as to whether it will not create some ailment or not bring about some diseases and so on and so forth. This may form part of what we call safety or physical risks. For instance, a person who is buying medicine or drug may be concerned with the possible harmful effect that may result from the use of the drug, especially when the drug is new. Our ladies, when they are buying lotion and the lotion is new, I mean, they are new to the lotion, maybe it's based on referral or recommendation, they may still perceive some risks. So some may move cautiously, they just want to apply, they want to do some kind of sampling. They may start by applying applying the lotion to part of their body just to see how it will feel, whether they will have some itching or irritation and so on and so on. All these things happen because consumers perceive risks. and it has implication for marketing that we'll be looking at later. There's also what we call the financial risk. This simply because exchange, typically most exchanges take place because we have something of value that we are giving in return for the goods and services. And a goal-oriented consumer will want value for money. So this one has to do with the uncertainty as to whether the price being quoted, whether the consumer will get value for money. In other words, the consumer may be concerned with the financial worth of the product to be purchased. Financial risks reflects consumers' concern about their monetary investment in a product or service, events, etc. All things being equal, if the product costs more, the risk associated with purchasing it is perceived to be higher. I mean, when we are buying oranges or things that are not that expensive, we don't perceive a lot of financial risks because of the amount involved. But when we are buying goods and services that requires large financial commitment, we tend to perceive high risks, and therefore we take certain steps to reduce such risk perception. In relation to financial risks, we can also talk about a situation where the consumer may be wondering whether the price of, let's say, a car will not be reduced in 3 months' time. Financial risks may also relate to time. Where the consumer anticipates that the price being quoted is likely to be reduced, they perceive high financial risks. Where they are also uncertain, or where they think or they believe that a newer or a better edition is likely to be introduced within the shortest possible time, they also perceive financial risks. That is whether the dealer will not introduce a newer model at the same price or even lower price soon. It may lead to high financial risk perception. Using the car example, the prospective car buyer will also be wondering whether the car is worth the amount or price being quoted, especially where there are limited queue and the consumer is new to this purchase situation. The consumer may perceive financial risks and may resort to certain strategies to reduce that uncertainty. There's also the psychological risks. You know, as individual consumers, we have egos and we have certain images of ourselves. And a goal-oriented person who wants to maintain his self-image or ego. We see ourselves in a certain light. Sometimes the consumer may be wondering whether a purchase decision will not affect his self-esteem, his image or ego. Because we buy goods and services to maintain our self-esteem or to enhance our self-esteem. So where he perceives that, where he's not sure whether the goods and services he wants to acquire will affect his image, there's high perception of risk, and therefore will influence his purchase decision. In relation to psychological risks, it could be inwardly driven or outwardly driven. Inwardly driven has to do with the way we see ourselves, but outwardly driven will have to do with what we think others, will have to do with how we think others would see us in relation to the goods and services that we intend to purchase. Whether this perfume that I want to buy, what will my colleagues think of me, and so on and so forth. All this thing has to do with the psychological risks, and marketers need to be aware of this. There's also the social risks, which somehow relates to the psychological risks. Because no man is an island, we are being influenced by the attitude, opinions of people within our sociocultural environment. And therefore, our purchase decisions are also important in terms of what we think, what others would think of us, whether it will be acceptable to people in our social environment or people, our colleagues and all that. It's a risk that marketers need to be aware of, social risks. This is the case especially when the product or service in question is consumed conspicuously. There are a lot of things, like I gave example of haircut and so on. When you buy cars, houses, the dresses we buy, these are things that we consume conspicuously. Even perfume, it says conspicuous consumption. The smell, you buy a perfume, very expensive perfume, and for a whole 1 month, nobody has given you a compliment that it smells nice. It's more like wasted resources and so on and so forth. These are items we consume conspicuously, and therefore we may come with some social risks. We may be wondering whether the use or possession of this product will not embarrass us in the company of friends and people we respect. So a goal-oriented consumer who perceives high social risks will take certain steps to want to reduce such risks. And this knowledge is important to marketers in terms of strategy that we'll be seeing soon. We can also talk of time risks. In talking about time risks, we should look at time risks in terms of the time that it requires to study or to know about the product in question, or the time span it will take to utilize the product, or the time it will take to even fix the product in terms of when it breaks down. It may also involve the time that it will require to seek information about the use of the product, or the time that we'll use to search for the product. Where consumers perceive that the time is unduly long, they perceive high risks and vice versa. And this should also be of importance to marketers. So we are saying that the risk refers, time risk refers to the length of time consumers must invest in buying, using, or disposing of products and services. The time that you spend in acquiring and using and disposing of products is important. Now the question is, how do consumers handle risks? In this, we'll get the marketing strategies. The question here is, what do consumers do to reduce perceived risks? Because anytime there's perception of risks, the consumer is faced with some kind of tension, goes in a state of disequilibrium. It's a discomforting situation, and the consumer will want to dispel or reduce these risks. So let's see how typical consumers, the actions they take in trying to reduce risks that they perceive in the marketing environment. First, consumers seek product information because they said, for lack of knowledge, my people perish. Especially in a high purchase involvement situation or in a high involvement situation, consumers tend to seek information. What is the implication for marketers? Marketers must know where and how consumers seek product information. And marketers need to make available relevant information for decision making, for consumer decision making. Apart from seeking product related information, consumers, all things being equal, tend to stay loyal to a particular brand because these are tried and tested brands. They don't want to try new products and all that. So we are saying that consumers stay loyal to a particular brand, all things being equal. But this has several implications for new product introduction and so on and so forth. Marketers will need to bring brand loyalty. Marketers of new marketers who are entering an already established market need to look at the implication, need to look at this in terms of how consumers are likely to receive their new brands or products. I'm saying that this strategy is useful in the case of familiar products or brands, in terms of repeat purchases and all that, things that we normally buy frequently. Once we are satisfied, we are likely to. But of course, consumers also have need for innovation and so on and so forth, or need for novelty. So it's not automatic that consumers will always stay brand loyal. But where they perceive higher risks, they tend to stay brand loyal. This has implication in several forms. Consumers also select by brand images. The various brands in the marketplace have certain images they've built over a period of time. So again, the caveat is where there are limited basis for making evaluation. It's not automatic. Where the consumer has limited basis or has no knowledge of how to evaluate, they tend to select by brand image. In other words, brands which are respected in the market, brands which are popular, they tend to go for such brands where they perceive higher risks. In terms of distribution is also important. Where there are limited queues and consumers perceive higher risks, they tend to rely on store image. In other words, the product may be new, but perception of risk may be reduced depending on the image of the retailer or the wholesaler who has stocked and who is promoting the product. All these things have implications for new products and so on and so forth. Again, where there are limited queues in a given buying situation, consumers may buy the most expensive brand. I'm not saying consumers will, I say where there are limited queues. A knowledgeable consumer who is able to evaluate a product based on quality, features, or dimensions will not necessarily buy the most expensive product as basis for quality. So we are saying that where there are limited queues for evaluating the brand or a product, consumers tend to buy the most expensive brand in this regard. That's why sometimes unscrupulous retailers, they understand this dynamics. So they may give you brands of the same quality, and in trying to get you to purchase, they may give you two brands and quote one, give one at lower price and give one at a relatively high price, where you have no knowledge about the quality of this brand. Chances are that you are likely to judge the brand with a higher price tag as superior to the one with a lower price tag. So we are saying that where there are limited queues for making decisions or for evaluating brand, consumers tend to rely on price as the most important criteria for making evaluation or judgment. That's why I'm saying that some street hawkers exploit this knowledge in the most unethical manner. Point 6, we are saying that consumers also handle risks or reduce risks through reassurance. So consumers seek reassurance. What do we mean by reassurance? Sometimes consumers seek reassurance in the form of money-back guarantee. He or she perceives high risks. The only reason he wants to acquire that product is for the retailer to assure him or her that in the event that you are not satisfied with the product, I'm prepared to pay back your money. In other words, it's a kind of guarantee. And this is common practice, especially in high involvement purchase situation. reassurance may come in several forms. A consumer, apart from warranties, the retailer may allow consumers to try products or give them sampling or samples, or may make available account managers or service points where they can go for maintenance and so on and so forth, or where they can bring in the brand that they are not satisfied with in exchange for another, and so on and so on. All these are strategies that can be used to give the consumer reassurance. And it's not uncommon to find in the marketplace. For instance, consumers may test drive a car before finally deciding to purchase, because, I mean, cars, all things being equal, are expensive items, and therefore consumers tend to perceive high risks. Thank you. We've come to the end of section 7. You may look at these references for further reading. Thank you. This for how many minutes?